Okay, we are. Okay. This is the fourth session of our Decolonial Dialogues, Ramon, and we were planning to discuss the problem of political power and the state for social movements in Europe. But we are not going to do that because we are still waiting for the results of the election in the USA. The whole world is watching this. So let's start to try to provide a decolonial analysis of what's going on with the election in the USA. So give me your take on it.
Well, to understand what is going on in the USA, we will need to, in a sense, go a little bit back in time and understand the overall context of the USA in the 21st century. What are the challenges? Because that is what is going to explain two versions of white supremacy, especially the one by Donald Trump. If you remember, in the 1960s, there was the Civil Rights Amendment, and that Civil Rights Amendment came out of the struggles of the civil rights movement, that it was led by the African American population, but it was not only by the African American population. There were movements coming from indigenous communities, coming from Latino community, coming from Asian American communities. And it was a broad movement. And it received support of a part also of the white youth that at the time, as you remember, it was the late 1950s and especially 1960s culture or counterculture that was going on at a world scale. But in the USA, you remember, it was very, very important. And a lot of activists from the white communities took side and supported the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement and it was a great achievement to make an amendment to the Constitution in 1964, where for the first time in the history of the United States of America, it was a formal recognition of the equality of all the races. Formal, I'm saying formal, it was not real, because in the real life, things do not translate in a mechanical way between a change in law and a change in reality. The USA, since its foundation in 1776 until 1964, that is 188 years, 188 years, it was legal to discriminate against people who are racially inferiorized. That is, in a sense, what is called in the USA people of color. It was legal to discriminate. After 1964, with the Civil Rights Amendment, it became illegal to discriminate in an overt way against people of color. Now, I'm saying 188 years of the foundation of the United States of America as a state. I'm not adding there the hundreds of years of colonialism previous to that, 50 years, something like that. So we might say USA has been close to 200, 300 years of overtly discriminating against people of color. Only in the last 66 years, you have in the Constitution, the recognition of equality of races. Now, what happened next day after the approval of the Civil Rights Amendment in 64 is not that racism disappeared, it's that racism, especially the racist discourses, kind of got, to use a computer language, the program got upgraded or updated. What they did was to shift from overt forms of biological racist discourses to what some people call new racism. I don't think it's new, it's very old, but maybe in the context of the USA, it was secondary relative to biological racist discourses, which is what we call today cultural racist discourses. Now, cultural racism used as a marker the culture of the groups that are being racially inferiorized, okay? And try to avoid talking about genetics and biological inferiority and things like that, because now in the eyes of the Constitution, it's illegal to use that language to discriminate against people of color. Before that, it was completely legal in the US Constitution over 300 years or more to discriminate against people of color. It was legal, there was no problem. And it's only very recent, 66 years. So compare more than 300 years to 66 years. It tells you something about how the culture of the people are still pretty much racist. The structures of domination are still racist. And if you add to that the fact, the timing issue that you cannot change 300 years from, one day to next, it will take a long time to overcome that. If you understand that 66 years is not going to transform more than 300 years, it will take a long time, and especially struggle because there is a counter-revolutionary response to the Civil Rights Amendment, which is what is known in US Congress as the Moynihan Report. The Moynihan Report was in 1965, and it was basically saying the reason why African Americans have higher unemployment rates than white populations is not because of racism, it's not because of structural racism, it's not because of Jim Crow, it's not because of slavery, it's not none of that, none of the above. It's because there is a pathology in the family structure of African Americans that goes back to West Africa. So they culturalize the differences by saying there's nothing wrong in America, it's just that these people that came here have this pathology in the family where women have babies like rabbits without a male figure in the home. So they don't have a two-income family. It's a single female household structure. And that's why they have higher unemployment rate. This is a complete counter-revolutionary argument because the amendment to the Constitution was precisely because of a struggle against racism, against structural racism. And then now you have the counter-revolution. And Moynihan, remember, was a professor at Harvard who was a senator of Massachusetts for a period of 50 years in the US Senate. And he was an intellectual, but he was a professor at Harvard. And he has published many books. And so he came up with this cultural racism where he's going to blame the culture of the group who happen to be the victim of racism of their own destiny, okay? So they start, in a sense, culturalizing differences, okay? Which you could say something similar today in what you see in France, that they are Islamicizing differences, and they're trying to make the question social inequalities, economic inequalities, they turn them into some kind of, cultural differences because the Muslims have this problem, that problem in their culture, in their behavior, in their attitudes, etc. So this goes back to the 60s in the USA, and so this white supremacy. Let's put it this way, an important section of the white supremacy, both Democratic and Republicans, okay, took the line of liberal multiculturalism. That is, we are all equal in the eyes of the law. I recognize your identity. I give you money for you to have your carnival, dance and jump in your carnival. But don't question who rules here. That is, liberal multiculturalism is making superficial identity recognitions without changing anything, leaving the whites ruling and controlling everything, but having this so-called inclusion, okay, quote unquote, where you include in a subordinate way elites of the groups that are racially inferiorized into the multicultural structure, basically changing things to not change anything. That is, I'm going to include now, give a color flavor to my political party or my political administration and so on. And then with that color flavor, I'm going to claim that we have overcome racism, okay? In fact, what they do is just making superficial symbolic recognitions without making any kind of reparation, to the communities that were affected over centuries by racism. No reparation, no structural transformations, etc. So liberal multiculturalism was the way, or has been the way, the US government and both Republican and Democratic administration have been ruling the USA since the Civil Rights Amendment, which is a form of cultural racism. They don't talk about biological racism. I mean, they say this is over, but in fact, the two things tied the moment you are naturalizing cultural behavior, habits, etc. And the moment you naturalize that, you're talking about, again, a biological form of racism. They just hide it. So it's not as if white America stopped having this view of biological inferiority. It's that it got hidden under the discourse of biological racism because it was politically correct to talk this way in public arena. They knew that if they continue talking in the old way with biological racist discourses in the public arena, they could be accountable in the eyes of the law. So in a sense, cultural racism became a form to hide biological racism also, So, and it ties with biological racism also because of the naturalizing cultural differences. When you look at both administrations, they were both practicing this liberal multiculturalism. And they tried to include in their administration, different faces to give a multicultural flavor to white supremacy. The white supremacy state, the white racial state, was never transformed. They just added a few faces here and there, a few symbolic recognition, Black Month, celebration of the Black Month, and things like this, to give multicultural flavor without changing anything. Now, the old forms of white supremacy, like Jim Crow, American apartheid, that was never overcome. It was politically defeated through the civil rights struggle and through the civil rights amendment of the Constitution. And it was so defeated to the point that they have to hide the way they speak in public using more the cultural racist forms rather than the biological racist discourses because politically it was defeated after the civil rights movement. Now, that didn't mean that there was a cultural transformation in millions of Americans who still hold to the old Jim Crow ideas. And over several decades after the Civil Rights Amendment, in private dinner conversation, they will say overtly what they think. And they will talk they will use the N-word, they will be talking in the old biological racist discourse, but when they come out of the door to their work or to their public events, they will talk in the new cultural racist way. Now, what is it that have made this sudden return of the old biological racist discourse represented by Trump? It has to do with the context of the 21st century. In the 21st century, there are major demographic transformations that are coming in the USA, that are already happening, and are coming with a force in the USA, in a way that probably will happen in Europe later in the century, but it's happening here in the USA, which is that there is a major transformation in the demographics of the country. White Americans, this is not something I'm inventing. This is official estimates of the US Census of Population. They are saying now for more than 10 years that by 2050, now they move it down to 2040, okay? So the numbers keep growing. They're saying, or they were saying since more than 10 years ago, the USA, the white Americans in the USA will become a demographic minority, okay? Now remember, this is a settler colonial society. That is, they've been operating with the impunity of being the demographic majority and having dispossessed everybody they have conquered here from resources, from power, from everything, okay? And they have been operating with impunity since then, being the demographic majority. So even though there've been challenges to their power through civil rights movement, through different rebellions across the centuries, from indigenous people resistance, from Latino resistance, Black resistance, etc., they have the demographic majority. So it's not an easy thing to create here let's put it this way, a national liberation movement like in other parts of the world where you have colonial administrations and people are the overwhelming majority in the countries that have been colonized and they kick out the white Europeans, you know? Here, that's a very difficult task because there's not such a space you can say that could be used as a platform for something like that. And you have an overwhelming, over centuries, white demographic majority as a settler colonial society with all the impunity that implies in terms of violence and dispossession. Now, with the challenge of now having to recognize that they're not going to be the demographic majority, they are very scared that now the demographic minorities that are going to be now the majorities are going to, in a sense, they're projecting their own bad consciousness to the people they have been oppressing over centuries. Because now they think that they're going to oppress them, okay? That now they're going to do to them what they've been doing for centuries to Blacks, to Latinos, to everybody else, okay? Indigenous people, etc. And all these atrocities, they see it coming towards them, you see, because that's the way they think. This is the back consciousness. This is similar to the debate of the Haitian Revolution in the 18th, 19th century. That they were opposing it because they said, oh, you know, the Haitians are going to enslave the whites. And this kind of thing. In fact, that never happened. You know, on the contrary, you have the first constitution that acknowledged equality of races, you know, in the world. In a way it didn't exist before, especially in the Americas, okay? You know, 1776, as I mentioned earlier, the Constitution of the USA acknowledged the right of racial discrimination against people of color, you know, until 1964 with the Civil Rights Amendment. So the Haitian Constitution, after the Haitian Revolution, was a very significant, had a lot of world historical significance in terms of a country that is a revolution led by people who were enslaved and who put a constitution there that breaks all the rules of what white supremacy have conceived and white colonialism have conceived at the time, you know? And now they're going to say, they were trying to oppose the revolution by saying they're going to enslave whites because they thought in their back consciousness, this is what the other side is going to do to them. I mean, if I don't do it, they will do it. This is like the law of the jungle, you know? They have this Hobbesian, you know, the philosopher, British philosopher Hobbes, who thought that this was, you know, individuals in the jungle, you know, and they have to be some kind of deal or social contract there, because if not, people will eat each other like wolf, you know, they will be eating each other. He used the image of human beings as wolf. And so this is something similar now. Now they think and they feel that if they become a demographic minority, they're going to lose power. Here is where then comes the whole xenophobic issue, because the rising population in terms of numbers, demographic numbers, are the Latinos. Latinos crossing the border. So this is where they're obsessed about the wall, okay? They're obsessed about the wall. They're obsessed about, trying to stop the growth in number of the Latino population, because they know that's of all the minorities, this is the group that have the rising numbers that is going to make the difference in the whole country because of the big border with the USA. And here comes the obsession of the wall. Here is now come a guy who is overtly white supremacist, like Donald Trump, who have relationships with the KKK, you know, going back to his father, including himself, who has been on record with all these overt biological racist discourses, etc., without hiding it, with no shame. And this guy comes now in a moment of economic crisis for the white population. After 2008, 2009, around 36 to 40 million Americans lost their homes. I mean, 12 million families lost their homes. In terms of total population, it's around, with a conservative number, is, you know, a couple with one kid, you know, 36 million people, okay? But it's even more, it's about 40 million lost their home. A lot of them were white Americans. Now, what do you do in a situation like that, where now you are losing economically because you are not anymore having the resources you used to have as a white population? The empire is declining with rising powers in the rest of the world. China is displacing the USA as the central economy in the world, okay? And then domestically, they have the days counted because they know that in a few decades, it could be in a decade or 15 years, it could be less than that. They're going to be a demographic minority in the USA. So now what do you do? What do you do now? And here is where you have the discrepancy between two versions of white supremacy. The liberal multicultural version, which is basically saying, you know what? We are going to be a demographic minority, but all we need to do is just create a liberal multicultural system where we keep ruling and make some symbolic gestures to the people we oppress by including some of the elites, and give, you know, in the political administrations at the level of city hall, at the level of the federal government, at all the levels, including multinational corporations, let's give a multicultural flavor to everything so that we can claim we're not racist, so that then the people we oppress, structurally racist, you know, people who are victims of structural racism, cannot have a claim, you know, against us, because we're making these gestures that is going to keep them in their place. Instead of creating a situation of racial polarization, what we do is we split them from within by co-opting co-opting those who are for liberal multiculturalism. And then you have the other sector, which is the Trump group, which are the ones who wants to go back to Jim Crow, wants to get rid of this liberal multiculturalism, and let's go back to Jim Crow, let's make white America great again. Let's go back to the years without any shame, where we go to the streets and we lynch people, we put people in their places with militia, with people with weapons, white militias, and so on. And this is what is coming. This is what is happening. Now you have all these people who were in the closet, hiding in the closet for many years. What Trump did was to unleash these people to the streets. I mean, now they are way there, empowered and feeling justified, because now you have a president who is constantly tweeting white supremacist discourses in the old-fashioned way. And these people feel now supported, empowered by this president, and now they feel they are protected by the White House to go to the streets and do whatever. Look at what is happening right now as we talk in the USA. Right now, you have a white supremacist president who have lost the elections, but he refused to recognize the results. And he's been calling. Right now, they dominate the Supreme Court. They have the majority. He has named 2 of the 9 Supreme Court judges. They have a majority of 6-3. And he's trying to repeat what happened in 2000 with George Bush Jr., where he lost the elections. The governor of Florida was his brother. They stopped the counting. Al Gore, the president who won the election, took the case to the Supreme Court. And guess what? The Supreme Court decided not to count the votes because it was a Republican majority Supreme Court. The judges were majority Republican. So they decided not to count the vote. That's how George Bush Jr. became president of the United States. And the rest is history. And look at the consequences of that presidency to the world today, okay? I'm not saying that Al Gore would have been 100% different, but I think Al Gore would have been, will have had different policies, especially in relation to all these wars that the US got involved, that are still there, Iraq, Afghanistan, all this stuff. Maybe Al Gore would have been, would have had a different policy there. And I'm saying this because if you look carefully today, now this is different. Al Gore is not Joe Biden, or Obama. I mean, you look at once you have the unleashing of all these wars in the Middle East, all this stuff happening, all these fascist laws approved, the Patriot Act, eliminating habeas corpus in the USA. Well, you were innocent until proven guilty. Now you could be put in jail and throw the key without going through a court, process under the laws of anti-terrorism in the USA. So they have Guantanamoized the USA. Now the whole USA is like Guantanamo territory. Anybody could be put in a jail without being put in front of a judge. And they can throw the key away and leave you there forever because there are laws that allows that to happen to US citizens. And this was approved by Obama, by the way. And I'm saying this because now the difference between Biden and Trump in terms of, for example, foreign policy is zero. They're going to be the same policies of aggression, of imperialism, of sanctions, against Venezuela, against Iran, against China. There's no difference there, okay? And the difference is more secondary domestic issues, very secondary, not even a major difference in the economic outcomes. So now you have a fight between two versions of white supremacy. The old-fashioned version of Jim Crow, etc., white supremacists, and the liberal multicultural ones. Liberal multicultural, the old-fashioned version is saying, forget liberal multiculturalism. Let's just go all the way like we were in the past. Let's make white America great again. Let's take over and let's put all these minorities in their place through force, through violence. Let's put them in their place. The liberal multicultural say, you know what, we're losing the numbers. If you do that, what you're going to create is a civil war here, and it's not going to push forward our agenda as white supremacy. What we need to do is liberal multiculturalism to contain any kind of internal conflicts. And while we keep sending the pipeline of people of color sent from communities to the prisons, you know, because if you remember, this increased part of the new version of liberal multiculturalism is not just identity recognition, it's also new forms of apartheid. The old forms of apartheid were destroyed with the 64 Amendment of the Constitution. Then they create new forms of apartheid. That is through prison industrial complex, for example, through militarization of the border of the USA, through mechanisms of violence and dispossession towards these communities, through new methods that were not there in the same way. They were there in terms of violence before, but now they're using policing and, you know, prison industrial complex, putting millions of African American Latino youth in the prisons with false accusation. In the majority of the cases, there are false accusation or sentences that are completely exaggerated to put them in jails. And of course, it's the new plantation, because in these jails, they serve as a cheap labor force for transnational corporations to exploit them there, because they don't have the same rights as citizens. So they are a cheap labor force. They don't pay them the minimum wage. So they have even industries. A lot of these prisons are private owned, and they are, in a sense, controlled by capital, you know, private capital. And they are exploiting the labor with industries there, etc. So we're talking about the new plantation, like Angela Davis call it, or name it this way. And so today we have a situation where this president have lost elections. He's now, the strategy he's pursuing is trying to do what George Bush did in 2000, which is try to find anything irregular in the process to take the case to the Supreme Court and try to win the election through Supreme Court judges. One of the things he's already doing, that happened yesterday, is stopping the counting of votes in states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, and I believe North Carolina, where the margin of difference between Trump and Biden is becoming very close. The more votes they keep counting, because a lot of Democrats send the vote by mail. So they're trying to contest the counting of votes. They want to stop the counting so that he wins by not counting the vote, like they did in Florida in 2000. And they want to do something similar, and they expect the Supreme Court to behave in the same way as the 2000 Supreme Court. It's a Republican majority and will take side with not counting the votes. And so this is, as at the same time, you have the mobilization of white supremacist militias that Trump have been encouraging and calling them for support in many parts of the country. During the electoral process, there were places where Black people were being harassed by police and white supremacy, trying to stop them from voting in many states in the South. You have right now some of these white militias surrounding some of the places where they're holding the counting of votes to threaten them not to count, not to count, like it happened in Florida in the year 2000 with the Cuban exiles. Cuban right-wing fascist exiles. They surrounded the building in Miami where they were counting the votes in Florida and threatened to burn everybody alive, inside that building. And that's when they stopped counting. Then that gave time for the case in the Supreme Court that Al Gore, at that moment, Al Gore, because Florida stopped counting, then Al Gore took the case to the Supreme Court and lost the case because the Supreme Court was Republican and decided not to count the votes. So it was the Cuban, remember, it was the Cuban extreme right groups who gave the election to George Bush Jr. in the year 2000 when they surrounded that building and forced the people inside to step out of the building and stop counting the votes. And something like that is happening now in some of these states that are being contested. And the funny thing is that in a place like Arizona and in a place like Nevada, where Trump is losing the election, but it's happening the opposite, like what is happening in Pennsylvania or in Georgia. That is that Trump, the more votes are counted, the more Trump gets closer. Well, over there, Trump haven't taken a case to court. Okay, he hasn't taken a case to court in those states because he wants the process of counting to continue. But then the funny thing is that you have white supremacists, militias, showing up in the buildings because they think the counting has to be stopped because that's a call made in the East Coast. And they're not seeing that stopping to count the votes go against Trump in this case, you see? And so there are things like this happening right now, encouraged by the wizard, imperial wizard of the KKK today, which is the guy sitting in the White House, Donald Trump. He's the one calling the shots through the Twitter. And so this is a situation where this is coming, people outside the USA, when people say we are coming close to a civil war, people take it like, are you kidding me? I mean, are you joking? They don't take it that seriously. In fact, there is a very high danger of this turning into a civil war here. Why? For a simple reason. Everybody here is armed with weapons. Mm-hmm. Everybody. There are more weapons than population in the USA, and everybody has their weapons under the bed. And this is just, it could be triggered in a second and turn into a civil war. You have already militias organized, white supremacist militia organized in all over the USA, very well armed, better armed than the police. You have the police infiltrated by these white supremacist militias, so you have many policemen, as we have seen with some of these cases of people being killed, people of color killed in the streets. Some of these police are also white supremacists. And then you have the people of color now also getting armed and also organizing in militias. There are now black militias emerging in places like Kentucky, in places like Michigan, in places that this is happening to. So this could turn into a civil war. And the President of the United States refused to recognize the results of the election so far. He already declared himself as that he won the election, even though none of these states run by Republicans have recognized that he had won the election in those states. Okay, they're still counting the votes. He already is calling to stop the counting, and he's already unleashing these white militias all over the country to defend his presidency. And there is, now with this, I finish this intervention. There is something that people are not paying attention, and that is, in the Constitution of the USA, you could have a situation where a president refused to acknowledge the results of the election, and he can lose the election, the popular vote and the electoral college votes, refuse to acknowledge it, take the case to court, say there was a fraud in the electoral process, and can be named, can go in January and be, how do you say that?
Inaugurated.
Make the inaugurated, in January. And that's in the Constitution of the USA. That is in the Constitution. What will happen there is that then the House of Representatives will vote by state, not by majority minority, but by states. And the representative of the states, the majority will decide if Trump be renamed or not. And remember that we need to see the results of the House of Representatives and the result of the Senate, because they're very close. And it could happen that that thing in the Constitution of the USA, something nobody talks about in the USA, but it's there in the Constitution. Nobody's looking at this, and something like that could happen, that the president just decide to stay in the chair and use the Constitution to empower himself to stay in the chair. And so this is where we are at right now. We are in the middle of a major crisis, and this could become, or it could happen that it will be solved in a civil war in the streets. That could happen. I mean,
what is the position of the army?
This is the Pentagon, that is the powers that be. As far as I know, and this is something that is not clear because they never make overt declarations, okay, about anything. But if you watch some of the comments by Trump has attacked the generals of the Pentagon several times in public, which shows that something is happening internal between Trump and the generals of the Pentagon. When Trump attacked them in public, he has done that several times. It's that something is happening. You see that we don't know exactly what is happening, but obviously there are contradictions there, because if you think about also, I'm sure, in also his attacks to the CIA, so the intelligence community of the US empire are also, in a sense, in contradiction with some of the things that Trump is doing, especially in the international arena. A lot of this contradiction comes from policies and things that he's doing that becomes, in the eyes of this security community of the US empire, Pentagon and intelligence agencies, as kind of weird. Because, for example, especially towards Russia and Putin, where some of the policies of Trump are a little ambiguous, about how he's dealing with Putin and Russia. They want to establish another Cold War with Russia. And even though rhetorically Trump follows up this, in practice with Russia, he's being more cautious than with China. With China, it's an overt Cold War, and sanctions and stuff. He has some sanctions also to Russia, but he's been behaving in a different way with Russia. And that's why I think that the intelligence community have some disagreements with him and are concerned by his policies. But now I think they're also concerned, and you could see that expression in some influential ex-generals, like the guy who was, I believe, Department of Defense in his administration, who is now an active oppositor of Donald Trump. I forgot his name. Who has come in public to attack his policies, domestic policies, because also from the security point of view, the last thing the US empire needs and wants in the middle of the decline of the empire, with rising powers elsewhere and challenges to their power all over the world, is an internal civil war. So they are very concerned that Trump's inflammatory policy is going to lead to a civil war that is going to weaken the US empire even more. So they are concerned also, there are some contradictions happening there inside the US empire and about this. In fact, if you look carefully at the international policies of Trump, Trump is in a sense accelerating the decline of the US empire at a world scale because of his crazy international policies. And now internally, he's creating such an instability inside the country that I'm sure that internally for people who are thinking the best interest of long-term interest of US empire are concerned about what he's doing also domestically, because if there is a civil war here, forget about US empire. I mean, U.S. empire will become a very, very low level kind of international force, because the whole thing will be focused on the internal affairs, and they will have to completely abandon whatever the atrocities they're doing internationally. So this is something that we need to pay attention what happens in the next few weeks, because we are getting close to a turning point where things can get out of hand, out of control, and this could turn into a civil war in a crazy way. And I think that the powers that be, like is Wall Street and the Pentagon, who are the two basic foundations of the power of the U.S. state, they are, I think, concerned too by the way he's handling the domestic contradictions. And I think that there is a preference among this financial capital and military elites to the liberal multicultural model, rather than to the Jim Crow model that is going to just make explosive the contradictions, the racial contradictions of the white settler society as the USA. Instead, liberal multiculturalism is a way of administration of these inequalities and racial domination that is less antagonistic and more hiding better the realities of white supremacy in the USA. And this is why a lot of these elites prefer the liberal model. That's why George Bush's son, if you watch carefully, he called to vote for Joe Biden. I mean, even George Bush, a guy as conservative as this guy, that you cannot say is anything about the left, he supported liberal multiculturalism domestically. He was the one who put there a blackface in the State Department for dealing with foreign affairs. Remember, Powell was the guy who went to the UN to defend the lies of the CIA that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify the war of Iraq. You remember that Condoleezza Rice was also part of the phase. You have Alberto Gonzalez in the Secretary of Justice passing the laws for torture in Abu Ghraib and in many of the dungeons the US empire has around the world, and in Guantanamo, So, I mean, then you have this tokenism that is taking elites from the domestic minorities to give a multicultural flavor to white supremacy. So even George Bush, so this thing about liberal multiculturalism vis-a-vis as a form of white supremacy, vis-a-vis the other method, the Jim Crow forms, is transversal to the political parties. It's not a Democratic versus Republican issue. It has turned now this way because of Donald Trump leading the Republican candidacy, that he's defending overtly the Jim Crow, all forms of white supremacy. And that's why you have a lot of Republicans now calling to vote for Biden, because they see a threat to the US empire in the way Donald Trump is handling both international and domestic issues from the point of view of the empire, And this is where you have then, the support to Biden coming from many Republicans now, okay? So this is what is happening right now.
All right. Many thanks for your analysis. Interesting to see how things will develop in the coming days, not even weeks, but we're talking now days. So we'll follow it,
Yes.
and maybe next week we'll have still a reflection on what has been realized. But for now, thank you very much, Ramon.
Thank you, Dew. Thank you very much for this discussion.